I'm Alan Wardis, and you're listening to Think Radio.
You know, as politicians, many of us believe that y'all ought to be so happy that we made the sun rise this morning in the east, and if you'll pay attention to us, we'll make it set in the west, you know?
That's Gunnison County Commissioner Phil Chamberland. As he prepares to leave office next January, we talked about the realities of local governance and what the future may hold in his political career. That and more on this episode of Think Radio.
Think Radio is supported by the Gunnison Country Times, Gunnison's locally owned hometown newspaper, and by listeners like you. To find out how you can become a Think Radio supporter, visit kbut.org.
Phil, thanks very much for joining me.
It's a pleasure.
I wanted to have you in for a couple of reasons. One, you're on the verge of leaving office, right?
January will be 8 years.
And you voluntarily term limited yourself.
Yes, I did, and there's a few reasons for that. You know, I've always been a fan of term limits, and only because I think that new people bring new energy, new ideas. However, I've had a lot of conversations with folks who are not big fans of term limits, and that have to be some definite thought about if you're going to term limit, then what do you do for that legacy part where people have the knowledge that they've gained over the many years of serving, right, and come back and, you know, so there was a lot of times where it was like, well, remember when?
Yeah. Well, so that was a campaign promise that you made when you ran the first time. Have you changed your mind about that?
Well, I don't know that if I were to do it again, I'm not sure if 12 years might not be the better option there, because I felt that as you get through your first term, you're starting to get your, you know, good strong legs underneath you and starting to have some capacity to say, okay, well, I could make a difference. And then in your second term, you're starting to get momentum and really being able to accomplish things and just get a real good stride going.
Right, and that's something a lot of people don't really fully understand, is just how intense the learning curve is.
As you know, I was involved in so many community activities and the Planning Commission and HOA boards, and just I think in 2002, I was on 7 different boards and commissions and whatnot, and
wow,
including the Planning Commission.
That's a lot of meetings.
It was a lot of meetings, and so I really felt that when I got to be a commissioner that I'd be able to hit the ground running, and I did hit the ground running. But what I found is that there was no way of knowing the breadth and scope of the responsibility of, you know, what you have underneath you when it comes to, you know, the hospital and the airports and Health and Human Services. And I've been lucky that I've worked really well with all the commissioners that I've sat with so far, as long as you're able to trust that Jonathan or John or myself were speaking in a unified voice, and we have the same thoughts and philosophies. And then when we hit something that I feel they may have a different viewpoint on, and that's one that we'll bring up and discuss during our commissioner items or whatnot, just to get their pulse, so that we're speaking, hopefully most of the time, in a unified voice.
What got you into politics to begin with?
That's a good question.
I mean, because you're not a professional politician.
Well, yes and no. I guess, you know, politics is everywhere. Right. When me and Missy were in Atlanta going through med school and orthopedics, and of course there's a lot of politics in medicine, and we thought, oh, it'd be so great to get down to Gunnison where we won't have to deal with all this politics, you know. But life, I mean, relationships are all political in a sense that you're getting to know people and wanting them to like you, and you want to find people you like, and so I think everything is politics, right? And real politics is closer to home. You know, my mom was a community organizer. I'm from a family of 10. And I guess psychologically, if I was to say, what is it in me that enjoys being a politician? It's probably because I'm the 7th child down the line.
You've been a politician for a long time.
Well, I did a lot of that, but I was also the invisible child, right?
Well, but so let's pick that up. You're saying you were the invisible child, and that was a motivation. Are you saying
I don't know that was a motivation, but I've got to think that, you know, everything that you are, if you follow psychology at all, is basically brought in that first 5 or 6 years of growing up. And so that's...
Yeah, an invisible child would want a voice.
Right.
It sounds like that's what you've been working on.
And so ever since I got here in 94, I've been, in the public eye in one way or another, just a larger and larger public till I became commissioner, and now obviously in the public eye of the whole county. But
as you look back on your 8 years as a commissioner, and you could probably look back a lot farther than that, sounds like, let's say in the time that you've had the vote on the board, what can you point to and say, man, I'm really proud of that?
That's a interesting comment because, as politicians, many of us believe that y'all ought to be so happy that we made the sun rise this morning in the east, and if you'll pay attention to us, we'll make it set in the west, And so, taking credit for things has to be done with a grain of salt because
Sure.
You're a directional player, but the people that do the work are the folks that are on the ground doing the work, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, but we've done some really good things. I mean, I look at the courthouse as one of them, and that was a interesting subject, depending on who you were talking to at the time.
Yeah, you took some heat for that.
I do think that the courthouse was something that we can be proud of because it's a great facility that will last us another 100+ years. I think it's a whole lot less expensive to maintain right now. And just certain small decisions like, do we spend the extra money to go for the thermal heating on it? And then, after our first year and our auxiliary boilers never kicked on once, well, that was a pretty good decision, right?
Yeah. You once said to me that local governance, especially at the county level, is really all about keeping the airport operating. Those were your words. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you if you've changed your idea about that a little bit.
I don't believe that's what I said, so I'd be interesting to see if you can find me that.
Okay.
I don't think that local government is political.
And that was the context of our conversation.
We have a job to do. And yes, we have a hospital to make sure that it stays and maintains and runs and operates. We have the airport, which I think is a huge asset for our community. When you look at the decisions that we make on a day-to-day and week-to-week basis, they're not political. They're what's the best way to get the job done that is at hand. And I think that bears itself out. If you look, since I've been on the commission 7.5 years now, there's probably 3 or 4 votes that we've had that have not been unanimous. We have a Republican and 2 Democrats. And so in a lot of other places, I think people spend too much time taking themselves too seriously, going outside of what they need to get done to be political. And we do some of that as well, but typically we do that in a unified voice. Also, whenever we're dealing with either Denver or DC, we try to speak in a unified voice for what's best for Gunnison County and what's best for the Western Slope.
When you look forward, and you're leaving office, so the vote is not going to be yours again after January, what are the big challenges that you see on the horizon for this community?
One of the biggest challenges is going to be trying to have one voice that pushes energy in the same direction. We're such a diverse community, right, between old miners and old hippies and ski bums and ranchers and business owners, and everybody has the right idea about what this community ought to be, right?
Or at least that's what they say.
Right. And so so that's always tough because if people aren't pulling in the same direction, then you don't have forward progress, whatever direction that is, right?
And you don't have a lot of leverage with some of the other bigger political entities that have a say-so.
Sure. So I think that the Community Builders Task Force and the project of the One Valley Prosperity Project that came out of that went a long way, though, in at least getting a feel for, I would say, what a majority of the people in the community feel like is a direction and what we ought to be focusing on. I've been very cognizant of not going down rabbit holes that I know aren't going to be productive, to spend a whole lot of energy on something that you won't get done when there's so much that we can all agree on that we need to get done. And so why not spend your energy on that? And so
that sounds like political wisdom that you get after you spend 8 years in the trenches. Really
That's
done.
political wisdom that you get being one of 10 children in a one-bathroom house.
And so that brings me to my next question, because one of the big topics, no matter who you talk to in what setting, is housing. How frustrating is it to be sitting in public office and facing an issue like housing that has implications for just about everyone you talk to? It's a downward throttle on economic development if you can't attract people here because there aren't places for them to live. It's a downward throttle just on quality of life in general. How frustrating is it to grapple with something like that and to realize at the end of the day there's not a whole lot that local government can do about it?
I don't know that I find it frustrating. I think it's just gotten to a point now where local governments have realized that we're going to have to do something about it. Now, different entities have different ideas about how that should be done, and so that can be frustrating.
As always.
Again, because we're not necessarily pulling in the same direction, but we're all pulling within the same radius anyway. And so at least there is some forward progress. It might be a little to the left, a little to the right when you're pulling, but I don't think anybody's pulling back on doing affordable housing. And so, we felt that it was a big enough issue that at our last board retreat, we put that in our strategic plan to create affordable housing. And when I say affordable, I'm not talking about low-income housing. I'm talking about affordable for people living here, and one of the issues that we had with the anthracite place and getting it filled up quickly was that there were too many poor people that made too much money to qualify to get in there, right? So you got to make $20,000 a year, or you got to make,
Yeah.
And so if you're making $30,000 a year,
Which is still not very
you're not
much money.
flush with money, and yet you couldn't get into a 50% AMI unit.
So there's a lot of tweaking that goes on with trying to figure out what can be done.
I think it's a supply and demand issue, and if you look at the progress that's happened in the last year and a half towards just the recognition that this is a serious problem and we need to do something about it. And you look at the people that have looked into our community after we've made that announcement that, with the needs assessment that was done, we've had several people come in and say, okay, well, what can I do to help? And there are several projects that are occurring now on the horizon that are going to make a big dent. I just want to see housing be built. And so if we can increase the supply that's out there, then I think affordability will find its leveling off area.
So it sounded like you just said that you're not too sure there's a huge role for deed restrictions to play, that you think just increasing the supply itself will take care of affordability.
There is a huge role for deed restrictions for the right projects. That's part of the mix as well. But I don't want to see somebody come in and say, deed restrict everything to 50% AMI, because
For the reasons you already mentioned.
that leaves a lot of people out on the street.
So here's another issue that I would say if you sat down a group of any 20 people and asked them what they thought the biggest challenges are, a lot of them would say housing. But I think the second thing on the list is likely to be recreation. And the fact that Gunnison County now is getting more and more and more pressure on our public lands and outdoor recreation amenities than we ever have before. What can be done at the local level to deal with this? I mean, these people are coming. They're going to come, as you said already. We've been discovered. What can actually be done? If you were sitting in front of those 20 people and they brought that issue up to you, what would you tell them?
Well, first off, I would say the problem is not recreation. The problem is our inability to handle the recreation that is occurring in a effective way.
So you're talking about infrastructure?
Infrastructure and whatnot. If you look at, well, let's take Matt McCombs, who was in the Smoky Mountains. He's now our local forest ranger, and he'll tell you that what we look at as an area being overrun is not.
It's all relative.
It's all relative.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we need to do, and again, it comes down to how do you fund these things and how do you get a community as a whole to focus on it. And that's happening now. And I think that the Sustainable Tourism and Outdoor Recreational Committee is a great place to start. And that was modeled after our Gunnison Sage Grouse Strategic Committee, which was very effective in being able to mitigate the eventual listing of a bird.
Well, we were talking about recreation, but you went to sage grouse.
Well,
so I'm
we'll
going to
come back to that.
I want to pick up that thread right now.
Okay.
Because that's a huge question on people's minds, too. Is speaking of arm waving, there was a lot of Chicken Little arm waving over the listing of that bird. And since November 2014, when that listing was published, almost nothing has happened.
That's your perception. And that's because we've had a lot of really good people who are managing it and working on it and making sure that it doesn't create an issue.
Well, don't misunderstand me. I don't mean that nothing has happened locally. Right. I mean the Fish and Wildlife Service that was portrayed as this gigantic federal juggernaut that was going to run in here and change the way land use worked everywhere. None of that has really materialized.
Well, you got to look at what is the politics at the top first, right? And see that changed quite a bit a year and a half ago, and that can change again just as easily. And that's one of the things I don't like about politics is that the higher the pendulum swings to one side, typically it's going to swing higher on the other side, right? Because we don't have a braking system on it.
That's physics.
And so, I mean, there's opportunity for the Fish and Wildlife Service, I think, to be able to come in here and make things more difficult. And you say that you haven't seen a whole lot, but I suspect you're not the owner of a property that's trying to do something that is Tier 1 sage grouse habitat. From my perspective, the listing was not necessary. I don't think the bird qualified for listing because of the fact that they came in and said, don't do anything different. So they're not necessarily worried about the bird population decreasing if they're saying what you're doing is working. And the numbers were showing that the bird was increasing. So what I'm proud of, and this started way before I was there, so I don't want to take any credit for it, but what I'm proud of as the county has been upfront and very active with all of its constituencies that this would affect in trying to find ways to prepare and to mitigate and to try to stave off a listing. And I think that we did all the work that was necessary to stave off a listing, and they listed it anyway, and so we'll let the courts figure that one out in the end. But I think that shows what you can do if everybody focuses on an issue, right?
Well, so let's come back to recreation then. You say that this new committee is modeled after that sage grouse group. What can the community do to tackle this particular issue?
Well, I think we need to look at what we're doing strategically. And so when it comes to recreation, why do we feel we're overrun when we're at Obie Joyful Campground or when we're up in Gothic? And look at the little bit that we did, speaking of Gothic, in tweaking some of the
Dispersed campaign.
do's and don'ts up there,
Right.
and it's helped a lot. But it's created the pressure elsewhere, and so you got to create the infrastructure. Education is a big part of it as well, and I think that this committee will do that. And again, looking at it strategically, let's put everybody who's out there who's got vested interests in these amenities in a room and say, all right, let's all decide what we want to do strategically to make this better, and then let's all pull in that direction. And then, funding's always going to be an issue, but we're working on it now with the National Forest Foundation to set up some sort of a sustainable funding mechanism for us to look at what Crested Butte is doing when it comes to funding recreation, and what Mount Crested Butte is doing towards funding recreation, and what Gunnison is doing towards funding recreation. They're done in silos, right? There's a little bit of a broader perspective of, okay, Crested Butte does a lot of stuff outside of Crested Butte to help amenities. But what if everybody took that money and pooled it together, and then using the store committee or subcommittee of store to figure out, okay, what are the priorities that were set by the community, which would be set through the store committee. But having this pool of money that we can leverage is something that I'm trying to work on right now to have happen, because I think that is the best thing we can do to help with our perceived overcrowding.
All right. Well, let's shift gears for a second, because I'd love to know what you'd say to somebody who grabbed you in the grocery store and said, Phil, I'm thinking of running for public office. What advice can you give me?
I'll give you a piece of advice that Kathleen Curry gave me that I think is probably the best piece of advice to start off with. And that's be yourself. Don't try to be what you think constituency is looking for. Don't just be yourself, because you know how to be that better than anything. Right? So start with that. And then I would say, frankly, for me, it's go for it. It's been really enjoyable. And of course, everybody knows I'm certifiable. Having said that, I have...
I wasn't going to say it.
I said it for you. But I've really enjoyed my tenure as a county commissioner, and everything else that I did just kind of prepped me in the how to navigate personalities and whatnot. But it's been really fun, and you can make a difference. And frankly, if you're just going to sit there and complain, and you have the wherewithal and the desire to do something and you don't do anything, then I think you give up your right to complain. So
get in there.
So get in there and do it. You know. So, number one, I think it's rewarding. I would tell them that. I would ask them why.
Yeah.
Right. If you're running because of one specific issue that you didn't like, and by God, then
because guess what, you're going to have to deal with
you're in
25
for a
other
You're
things.
in for a surprise, right?
Yeah.
And then realize that for as much as it may bother you, we work at the speed of government.
So think glacier when you say that.
Well,
right?
think directional, think long term. I think everything you do has long term ramifications, and so think about
you take
those.
your time.
But also don't think that you're going to be able to get into a public office and within 6 months be able to make drastic changes. If you did, then I don't know that those are going to be great changes, number one. I would think that they would be political more than functional, and I don't know that that's the best route to go.
And they might not last.
And they may not last because the pendulum swings both ways.
Well, you've said it's rewarding. What are the hardest parts about it?
Time consuming. It's a full-time job. Up until a year ago last May, my wife had her own business that I had a little part in as well when it came to payroll, accounts payable, things of that nature. And then I have my excavation business, which made it very difficult to be able to spend the time that I needed to spend on a business and spend the time that's needed on the business of the county. And so I've traveled a lot, go to a lot of meetings, if I wanted to, and sometimes I get chastised here and there for, I haven't seen you a council meeting, or I haven't seen you here, I haven't seen you there. And it's like, I can pick 3 meetings a night to go to if I want to. But I also, I'm very big on family, very big on, work hard and play hard. And so you have to have some boundaries there, and you can't do it all.
So somebody who's thinking of office now should make sure they have the time for it.
It's time consuming. Well, it doesn't have to be. I mean, you could show up, one Tuesday a week for your work sessions twice a month, and for your regular meetings twice a month, and say the heck with the rest of it, right? I mean, why do I need to be part of Club 20, right? Why do I need to go to CCI? You don't have to. These are all choices that we made. And I think that that's been the blessing for the county as a whole, is that for as long as I can remember anyway, and certainly with the, Hap and Paula and John and Jonathan and myself, that people have taken the job seriously and wanted to do what was right. And what's right is spending the time to make sure you know what the issues are, and then try to find solutions to some of those issues. And showing up on Tuesday and going through a packet, 4 times a month is not necessarily giving the county their money's worth, I guess.
What comes next for you?
That's a good question. 4 years off. I know that,
You're not going to get back on 7 boards?
No. No. I mean, obviously spending a lot of time in Nashville now with Missy, trying to pursue where this singer-songwriter thing might take her. And, we've got a place in Maine as well. But I'm going to work my business, so I'm here for a few more years working hard. And then we'll see. I've been solicited for the past 6 years now to run for the state level.
And are you considering that?
Well, I've got 4 years to hopefully come to my senses. but yeah, I would consider that.
What office in particular?
I hate campaigning. It's just
that's a problem.
It's not in my nature, right? A House district, you got to campaign every 2 years. A Senate seat, you campaign every 4 years. And so that's probably what I would look at if I was going to do anything. But, right now, I don't know. There's some things that are appealing to that. I've got some angst about not having run for commissioner again. I know I would have enjoyed it. And I didn't not run because I said I would only run 2 terms, because I think that I could have easily justified running again. But I just need time for myself. I need time to
sit on your porch before that fool of a client shows up.
My wife just retired, so that's been a year, and she's finding her direction and what she wants to do. And I've never sat back and relaxed and said, what do you want for you? Mm-hmm. And so we'll see. Mm-hmm. Hang out with my wife. We have a great time. We have a porch that is due east and a porch that's due west, and we drink coffee in the morning on the front porch, and we drink wine at night on the back porch, and we laugh a lot. And so I'm going to spend 4 years laughing with my wife and figuring out who Phil Chamberland is.
Well, I wish you the best of luck with that. Thanks for the conversation.
Yeah, anytime. Thank you.
ThinkRadio is a production of Alan Wardis Media. To contact Alan, visit alanwardismedia.com.
Thanks for listening. Join me next week for another great conversation on Think Radio.